Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending this workshop on how to recruit, organize, and energize volunteers. And after talking to the director of United Way today, Louise, if we know anything, not to burn them out, Jason. I'm Joanne Feitz Kaufman. I'm the board chair of the Fire Safe Nevada County Coalition. And tonight's workshop is being led by volunteer Jason Landers. And I'll let him tell you a little bit more about himself and his volunteer experience. We also have some experienced Firewise community leaders to share their successes and challenges. We might get Maureen Graber or Mo from Banner Mountain Firewise Community, Kristen Cook or Casey from You Bet Firewise Community. And I see Dario Davidson there if he wants to share a thing. So there will be lots of opportunity for interaction, sharing, and questions. So we may hear from you or other leaders. So welcome. Thanks for attending.
All right, thanks, Joanne. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Joanne mentioned, my name is Jason Landers. Currently I work for the Bear Yuba Land Trust as the conservation manager. And some of my work involves right now volunteer management and volunteer leading. But prior to this position at the Land Trust, I worked for another nonprofit in Southern California for 4 years, doing pretty much exclusively volunteer engagement. And so I've have events our experience working events from 1 to 2 volunteers up to like 200 volunteers. And so hopefully share some of these, my experience with you all. I'm pretty new to the Firewise community world, so I'm hopeful that some of this is going to be relevant, but you might find some of it is redundant. But anyway, I hope you get something out of it here. So let's go to the next slide here. What I'd like to talk about today, this evening, is a short recap here. We got planning a volunteer event, how to recruit volunteers, what makes a successful workday, your follow-up to these folks, some of these challenges, and then open it up to discussion. I've got a couple of questions to help prompt us and get that discussion going, but really open to whatever's at the top of your mind here. So planning a volunteer event, I think it's important to remember that you're not just planning the day of the event, right? You're doing all that prep work, you're planning that work day or this event, whatever that event might be, and even follow-up is included in that. And so some of those first steps you've got to think about are, assessing these projects in your community and, determining which one is actually a high priority or which few are high priority projects. And I'm going to assume that many of you that are here, if you're finished your risk assessment and your 3-year action plan, or you're in the process of completing those documents, and really, those should inform these volunteer opportunities that you're trying to recruit for. I found that the best approach, is working collaboratively to identify these priorities, working with your neighbors, working with this committee, if you have a committee in your neighborhood. But those identifying those priorities is key. And some are going to be incredibly easy to identify and they're going to be impactful, and others might be challenging to achieve with a small group of volunteers. Clearing your ingress and egress routes, I would imagine might be a really top priority for folks. But depending on the vegetation type, it's easier to pull Scotch broom and may not be that easy to cut down 10-inch diameter trees or larger. You might have to hire a contractor. So keeping that, the relevancy and the achievability in mind when you're thinking about projects. But either way, I found that in my experience, it's best to work together to identify those priorities, since you're kind of living near each other. And I found that when you're working together, you get a shared sense of ownership and this pride in the area and the work that you might be doing. And it's oftentimes a really great way to engage and recruit volunteers because they have that shared responsibility and will more likely show up to these future events. And I think it's important to stay flexible, right? It's okay if you identify another project that wasn't in your assessment or action plan, but you've realized that it's going to be impactful and achievable and fun. And that's what's important to remember, those kind of three things: that is it impactful? Is it achievable with these volunteers, with your group? And is it going to actually be a fun event so people want to show up for later events? When we talk about recruiting volunteers, I think, it's important to remember that it's highly unlikely you're going to get 100% participation from your community members. I would be surprised if you do. When we schedule events at the Land Trust, I would say like 10% don't show up for whatever reason. And so give yourself that flexibility. Um, but at the same time, it's important to reach out to folks that are going to reach them most directly. So, and you may not know what method that is. Whoever's on the phone, if you don't mind muting, that would be great. Um, it's important to thank you. It's important to reach folks and whatever method works best for them, and know what method they prefer. But if you're kind of tackling it from multiple angles, you might have a larger success rate. So whether you're knocking on doors or emailing or phone calling or putting up flyers or signs or newsletters and articles or even posting in a social media group, um, do all of that, right? Reach those folks in many ways, and you'll have a higher success rate, of recruiting those folks. When you're reaching out to folks, it's important to keep your messaging simple and concise and persuasive, right? I mean, it's important to kind of put yourself in these volunteers' shoes. I mean, you're all volunteers, but you don't want to see like an event that's like 2 pages long. I look at that stuff and I say, like, you know what? I don't know if it's like, get to the point. You know what I mean? Be concise, be persuasive, and really highlight those things that you're trying to achieve, right? And so talk about why your project is important, right? What it is, what are you doing, what's the ask? Clearly communicate why I should care. Like, I want to know what the impact this event is going to have for the larger community. It may just be a networking event. It might be you're doing a Scotch broom pull or whatever it might be, but clearly communicate that impact. What am I going to get out of this event? And, oftentimes folks are volunteering on the weekends, maybe in the evening. So these folks are giving up their time to spend on your event. So keep that in mind when you're doing your outreach. And as I mentioned, don't forget to make that clear ask, right? What's the date and time? Where are we meeting? When are we meeting? Do I need to bring tools? Do I need to bring food? Whatever it is you're asking, right? Be very clear with what you're asking, and don't forget to give folks plenty of notification, right? I mean, ideally, if you're scheduling something, a larger event, a month in advance would be great. If you can do it, if you have to do it sooner, you might not be as successful recruiting volunteers. I would imagine it's just going to depend on how involved some of your neighbors are, but the more notification, the better. And don't forget to do those reminder emails, right? It could be or phone calls or whatever, just those reminders that you're reaching out maybe 2 weeks before the event, a week before the event, and definitely the day before the event, just to give that last plug of like, don't forget, this is what we're doing, this is where we're meeting. Clearly communicate, from the beginning to the end. Some tools that I've found to be really helpful when you're doing any kind of volunteer engagement is Google Drive. Both of these programs are free, Google and Canva. Google Drive is really, essentially a collaborative workspace. Many of you might have Google emails, Gmails, but there is this whole other kind of workspace called Google Drive. And if you have an email, you have a Google Drive, whether or not you know you do or you've used it. You can create Word documents. You can create slideshows like the one I'm doing today. I created that in Google Drive. Um, you can use Excel, like an Excel or similar program to Excel. It's called Sheets. If you need to do some tracking, graph, do any kind of metric,
Oh God.
you can use that. You can also store your photos and do a lot of different things with Google Drive. And really, a tool that I've used many times is you can create these contact lists in your Gmail. So it could be a contact list just for your community members, right? And instead of every time you're doing an outreach or you're sending an email to folks, you don't have to, manually add those folks. You can just say, you know, Banner Mountain, type in your Banner Mountain Firewise community and your email will pop up. And it's really easy to generate those lists and kind of get your outreach going more quickly. Another cool program is Canva. This one is they've got a lot of free templates. It's kind of like a graphic design program. They have a free version. They also have a paid version. So some of their stuff is behind a paywall, but um, it really, if you're creating flyers, if you're doing articles, if you're doing social media posts, there's a ton of templates that you can use um, that already have photos, maybe some really nice colors, really things that pop and really grab your attention. And ultimately, they're going to save time, and it forces you in a way to kind of keep your messaging concise and clear and fit on one page. I mean, that's the ideal. What's everything, on one page so that I can just kind of read it at a glance. So those programs are fantastic. I highly encourage you to use them. Like I said, they're free programs. Canva, does have a paid version, but there's a lot of free tools in that free version that they're just going to be really helpful to kind of lend that professional touch to some of your outreach materials. All right. So what makes a successful workday? We've done our recruitment, we've done our outreach. Now we're at that point where we've got volunteers showing up. And the approach that I took was you might be doing like a community workday where you're pulling broom or clearing vegetation, or you're helping some folks do some home hardening. And so really it's important to start these days off with that introduction, right? Who you are, why you're doing this, why we're there today. Really tell that story behind your work. Oftentimes, I found that, especially if you've got new folks in the community or this might be your first event, good to start off with an icebreaker question. Just kind of maybe it's something fun and playful. At the Land Trust, we often will start our work days off with like, what's your favorite wildlife or what's your favorite tree in the area? Things that just kind of like break the ice a little bit and get folks talking. Um, don't forget to do a safety talk, especially if you're doing, you're using any kind of equipment. Talk about having that kind of buffer zone around folks if you're using things like weed wrenches or Pulaskis or things like that. And then, in that introduction, remind volunteers of that scheduled time frame, right? When are you taking a break? When are you ending? Communicate your goals for the day so everybody's on the same page. And really, it's important. Very rarely, I feel like, do volunteer events go exactly as planned. So stay flexible, and things will work themselves out. Um, you might have to provide some training, especially if you're using specialized equipment, whether that be, I mean, it could be something as simple as shovels. You could be using drills. I'm not, entirely sure what you might be doing for your event, but if think about that when you're scheduling your event, like what training might you need to share with folks. Do demonstrations of whatever tool you might be using, whatever you're doing. It's safe to assume that, folks don't know how to do what you're asking until they've told you otherwise, right? So if you're pulling broom, demonstrate that best technique. Make sure folks feel comfortable doing whatever it is you're asking of them. And that kind of on that same note, assign tasks, right? Folks are showing up to do work. So it's important to include everyone that shows up. They've taken the time out of their life to spend on this project. So give them some responsibility, give them a duty, and it can be a collective task, right, that you're all working toward, or individual tasks. But I found that giving them tasks really keeps folks, uh, working toward that goal, whatever that goal might be, at the end of your day. And really most importantly, is to stay positive and show appreciation, even if you don't get to everything that you were hoping to get to in your volunteer day, right? Just show that appreciation. Don't let folks get too bored. It can be hard to retain volunteers if they don't feel valued and appreciated. If they're not having fun, why would they show up again? So really kind of show that appreciation and celebrate those accomplishments, especially as you're wrapping up your day. Something like a Scotch broom pull is so easy to tell, what you've done. You've seen the pile of the broom or the pile of vegetation you're cutting back, and you can really visualize the work that you've done. So celebrate those accomplishments. Thank folks, for showing up, and it's always depending on what event you've got going on, but it's good to have food and water for folks. It doesn't have to be, a four-course meal at all. Snack bars, fruits, those are easy and relatively cheap. I found, water is sufficient. Barbecues are a great way to finish off your event. I realize that's not always easy or practical for folks. It's certainly an added, time that they have to spend, but there's certainly a great way to wrap everything up and celebrate your accomplishments. And just another tip that I found, during events is take photos, right? Take photos of those volunteers, take photos, and share them, right? That's the whole point of this, is really celebrate that work that was done. And those photos, you never know when you might need a photo of someone pulling broom, or someone lighting a fire, or a pile, or whatever, eating ice cream, whatever it is. Those photos can go a long way, and folks feel appreciated when they can see themselves, in action, basically. So don't forget to do that. And I think, the key takeaway here, that I want to impress upon folks, is that a successful workday is really how you retain volunteers. If folks are having a good time, they feel accomplished, they're getting work done, it's obvious, they're making friends, they're chatting. This is how you retain volunteers, right? It becomes easier and easier, to recruit folks down the line for whatever project you might be working on. And so, do your best to make sure folks feel valued and are having a good time during these events. All right. Um, Follow up here. Like I had mentioned, that the volunteer day doesn't start when you're actually working, right? You're doing all that prep work, you're planning, you're recruiting, you have that work day, and don't forget to follow up. I would argue it's equally important to your original outreach and your work day. Whatever it is you have to do to show that appreciation, you might be emailing or phone calls, maybe you're texting folks, knocking on doors, whatever you got to do to thank them for their participation and hard work. That really goes a long way. If you've taken those photos, you know, um, share those before and after photos, share those workday photos in that email or that outreach, material, whatever you're doing to share with folks. Um, and if you have another volunteer event already scheduled on the books, be sure to, include that reminder in your follow up. Don't just, kind of, it's just another easy way to kind of get folks, keep that momentum building, keep that momentum going. And I found, uh, at the land trust and at this other nonprofit that I worked at, we always posted photos on our social media. I don't know if some of these Firewise communities have, individual Instagram accounts, or if you've got, a Facebook group. Even if you're going to write an article for the Ubinet or whatever it is, and share that, always good to share those photos and really demonstrate, that hard work of folks. People love to see that. Um, and we talk a lot about volunteer leaders, and how do you get someone from a general volunteer showing up to become that volunteer leader and really take on some leadership responsibility and duties. And I found, it's important to just make that ask, right? It can be, while you're at the event, and you're talking about, what it means to be a leader, what it means to kind of lead these events and schedule events, and definitely include those in your follow-up emails. And it can be just a simple sentence like, if you want to become a leader, help plan these events, reach out to X, Y, and Z, right? These are the benefits that you get from that. Um, and at the Land Trust, we're doing a lot of work right now to recruit those volunteer leaders. I would tell you, I'm not going to lie and say it's an easy job. We've had something like, close to 1,200 volunteers throughout the year, and we've got 1.5 volunteer leaders, right, excluding staff. And so I recognize that your Firewise communities are maybe a smaller group, maybe they're larger, and you've got thousands of folks in the neighborhood, but um, you don't know unless you ask. And when you make that ask, like I mentioned before, clearly communicate what that means. What are the benefits that folks are getting out of becoming a leader? Why would they want to do that? Share your story, share the reasons that you're participating and that you're volunteering. Um, and just be genuine and honest, right? I think that's what we found is, um, the easiest way to kind of get folks to open up and responsive, is just make that ask and be honest and genuine about your needs. Um, if folks are showing up for volunteer days, it's likely they care. And so, you're talking to people who maybe have similar mindsets. And so making that ask, um, might be easier for you. It might be easier for them to take that on rather than, just sharing this volunteer leader position on Facebook. But if you're directly asking folks and engaging with them and sharing your experiences, that I found that goes a long way. And like I've mentioned, it's not an easy thing to do, right? To just, um, get that person from a general volunteer showing up maybe once a year, to getting them, to that volunteer leader. But it's worth the ask, and worth that effort that you put up front. And I'd like to just kind of close on this follow-up slide with just, retention is key. It's really critical to the work you all are trying to achieve in the community. I mean, I drive around the county and see so much work that needs to get done. And I haven't been in every neighborhood, and you guys know your neighborhoods more intimately. And so you recognize that needs, especially as we're getting into, this weather and the hotter season right now. And so, um, having that successful volunteer day and following up with folks really goes a long way to retain folks for future events that you might have scheduled. All right. Challenges. The list is long, and I'm sure I didn't even capture everything here. The first one that came to mind for me is that short notice. I talked about that earlier, but really make sure you're given plenty of notification, right? I would say, if you're scheduling a larger event, 1 month is best. Send those reminder emails a week before, the day before, and make sure that you're making that clear ask of your volunteers, in those reminder emails. The lack of volunteers is another one. I mean, that's just the reality, I think, of the work that we're doing, right? I think, when you're trying to recruit and you're trying to do that, the initial outreach, it's good to include photos from past events, promote those past events that showed, how successful you were. Don't forget to schedule events on days that generally work for most people. So weekends, often work best. I found that scheduling events kind of early or mid morning is great. Don't schedule events on holiday weekends, or try to be mindful of other community events in the area so that you're not conflicting and can have the highest success rate of getting folks out. Um, and then of course, the folks who do show up, encourage them to spread the word, right? I mean, share their have them, ask them to share their experiences with their neighbors and friends. And it's a good way to kind of help with future recruitment. If they know, their friends and family have joined an event like this. So that can be an easy one. Fundraising, huge, right? I mean, I know that the county does these micro grants, um, and I know the coalition is working on some grants to help folks, but it's tough. It's tough, and a couple $1,000s really doesn't go very far when you're trying to clear out a long roadway or remove a bunch of scotch broom or whatever it might be you're doing. But I think what I found at the land trust, what we really like to do is lean on other resources, right, to keep our costs low. So oftentimes, if we're doing a scotch broom pull, we reach out to other organizations that we know have pullers, right? And we're asking for them. That's oftentimes the Fire Safe Council, and whatever those resources you might have or that you might need, there might be someone in your group who knows somebody who has them or can share them or kind of point you in that direction. So don't be afraid to lean on those resources. And then, of course, celebrate those folks who do contribute, whether it's monetarily or they're loaning out tools or, providing food, whatever it might be. Celebrate those folks at your event and really acknowledge them. That goes a long way, and really spread that gratitude. I think it's important to remember that volunteer event planning it takes time and effort, right? It's not something that's kind of really easy to do if you want to be successful at it. So in terms of that, I would, you know, if you haven't already, consider forming some kind of a committee to assist with that planning and execution events. And I don't know if that's common for all Firewise communities to have a committee like that, but lean on your resources. There's other groups um, who have and can kind of help shepherd you through that process, um, and really kind of share the burden of that planning. Whether you have somebody who might be doing only outreach and communication with folks, getting folks signed up. You have maybe a different leader for a person who's actually doing the event on the ground for that day. I have somebody doing follow up, right? Maybe it's only one person who's doing that, but it's great to kind of share the load, um, especially because considering everybody's a volunteer here. And as Joanne mentioned, I mean, you don't want to burn folks out. It's easy to get burnt out, especially if you have a low turnout or maybe things don't go as planned during your workday. But if you have a group to kind of lean on, it makes things easier for these work days. Um, the length of your volunteer event is crucial. Don't burn folks out. At the Land Trust, we often do events between like 1.5 and 2 hours. Sometimes our larger events, go between 2 and 4 hours. Um, you'll start to notice if you don't know kind of how that volunteer group is gonna, react to some of that work that you're doing. Be flexible. Folks may have to leave early. Some folks may be able to stay late, but you know, uh, after your first one or two events, you might realize like, 2 hours is actually too long. Maybe it's just 1 hour, and we get as much work that we can do in that 1 hour. Um, you want to keep folks engaged and feeling good when they leave the event. So, don't burn them out. don't schedule an 8 hour workday. We rarely do that at the land trust. Um, it's really, only staff is really working that long. When we, for some of our larger events, we, often schedule them around like 9 a.m. and we close around noon or 1. And that includes that introduction period, that where you're doing maybe an icebreaker and folks are kind of asking questions, you're doing a safety demo, the actual work time. Oftentimes we'll do a break in the middle, encourage folks to kind of take a break, drink some water, grab some food, and then at the end, we have a closing kind of circle where we're kind of talking about the impact that we had, what we've done, kind of future events. So kind of factor all of that into your event, and just don't burn folks out, and just remember that even small events with a small turnout is worth it. Celebrate that as a win. Stay flexible, stay positive, and really encourage folks to have fun out there. That's really the best way that I can kind of get around some of these challenges. So, my presentation is kind of wrapping up right now. I don't have much more to talk about. I really there's we can spend so much time talking about certain things, and so I really do want to kind of open it up to folks and see um, if they have any questions or concerns or share their experiences with folks. We have it looks like about an hour left here to do that. I do have some questions to help us prompt that, but I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns right now. And, we can go from there.
Um, Kristen Cook or KC has a lot to share. If we want to let her do that here.
Hi, is now a good time, Joanne? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, it is.
Awesome.
I'd like to say
First,
thank you to Jason. That was really interesting. Thank you.
That
and
was
helpful.
good.
yeah, I was going to say first, Jason, I look at you, and one of the things I look at you, I'm like, you have no gray hair. Can you please move to
It's
my
coming in.
community?
It's hard to see. It's hard to see in this.
I mean,
in
like,
this,
really? Can I just clone you and port you over? So I'll introduce myself for those who don't know me, and then I have a couple of kind of perspectives. The first is me, Casey, Kristen Cook. I head up the You Bet Firewise community. We are the largest geographical Firewise community in Nevada County at 13,000 acres and 700 parcels. So our community is divided up into 20 different neighborhoods. So one of my first challenges was recruiting volunteer neighborhood leaders. I know others have done it by sections and so forth, but with 20 different neighborhoods, I've kind of learned over time. We've been a Firewise community we're entering into our 7th year. So I had to learn by trial and error. As everyone knows, we're kind of on our own to figure this all out, which is why we're having this particular call and others. But a lot of aha moments for me over the years. The first was that I couldn't rely on just one neighborhood leader because, life happens. We take vacations, we have kids. So I set my goal depending on the size of the neighborhood from anywhere from 2 to 3 households. So back to what Jason kept saying about sort of share the wealth, right? And share the responsibility. It's still my goal. It ebbs and flows. Some neighborhoods, I have 3 solid households, and some, people change whatever their priorities are, and I have openings. But I do keep a chart of that. And I hold a neighborhood quarterly meeting. And at every meeting, I share where we are, and I ask the other neighborhood leaders for help. Who do you guys know? How do we keep this going? So it's kind of an ongoing thing at the neighborhood leader level. The other kind of aha for me, Jason focused a lot on kind of events and projects like Scotch broom parties and things of that nature. So we have a lot of sort of ongoing efforts from a Firewise community perspective that may or may not be event based. So I have found that the folks that are my contact points as neighborhood leaders and they come to my quarterly meetings, they're probably better at communication. They'll blast out the emails to their 40 parcels or whatever it looks like, and they're great. But then typically there's someone else who becomes the contact for, as Joanne likes to say, the boots on the ground work. And so depending on what is happening, I might rely heavily on that neighborhood leader group or on the boots on the ground people who, they're just get her done folks. We're very rural. They have their own tractors. They're not going to sit on a meeting. They're not going to look at their email. They're not going to, but man, you tell them that here's what's happening. I got a green waste bin and I need you guys to get out there and, fill it. They'll get her done. So what I've started to, realize over the years is that building this volunteer force is really also about understanding people's strengths and weaknesses and what they're interested in doing. So that's kind of the big aha. Couple other things I did want to share. One is that, I'm in my 7th year. I'm 64 years old. I've started messaging late last year that I'm going to be aging out. And I think it's important because one of the challenges we've realized with Firewise communities is that it's harder to get the younger people involved. They have kids, they have busy lives, that kind of thing. So I've basically been sharing that, we've made amazing accomplishments here in the UBET Firewise community. And if nobody starts to slowly step in and take on little bits and pieces and we form a committee, then all that work will come to a standstill. So I'm appealing to them in a sense that they have kids, they're vested here, they don't plan on moving, but from a wildfire safety perspective, if they want their home and their family to be safe, they're all going to have to start picking this stuff up a little bit. So from a kind of a strategy perspective, I've been messaging that. And in a meeting, I'll even joke and say, if you don't have gray hair in here, I'm talking to you. And everybody laughs. But so I think it's important. And I like what Jason said, that just be brave to ask and tell them what you need. But I'm also saying it's not what I need, it's what you need in order to be safe living here. So I wanted to share that. I'm starting to get a few of the younger group involved slightly. The other thing on these ongoing efforts, boy, this is the hardest one for me, you guys, is patience. I'm a get her done kind of a gal. The train leaves the station and I just bulldoze through it. I had a neighbor last week call me a hurricane. I'm like, okay, thanks. Sorry, Hurricane Casey. But the reality is I ask, but I can't expect. And when people disappoint or don't follow through or can't do it, you know what? Maybe 6 months from now they can. And I have now, going into my 7th year, realized people are they put things on hold and then they come back a year later and all of a sudden they're awesome and they contribute tons. So play the long game when it comes to volunteers. We can't just look at each person and say, well, they didn't help, they're worthless, it doesn't work. No, everybody has a spot to play. It has to be the right time for them. And so that's been working for me. But boy, when I say it's hard for me, that's that's super hard, right? So what I say behind doors and what I say to everyone is different. The last thing I wanted to share, and I could go on and on as Joanne knows, sorry, Joanne, kind of a tactical thing. When Jason's talking about the shifts, we do the big green waste, we bring chippers, we chip bins full, and I set up a Google form. As Jeff knows, I'm a real fan of Google Forms, and I do it in shifts. So what I ask is for people to come a morning shift or an afternoon shift. In this past green waste, I even broke it down to heavy work, moderate work, or easy work. And so the easy work is, anybody with the clipboard checking people in, greeters, traffic directors. And so what's interesting to me, and did that 2 years in a row, is I actually got emails from folks going, oh, I can't volunteer this year because, oh my gosh, and I had so much fun last year, but they are reaching out to tell me why they can't volunteer because we're making it manageable for them. And then some people will, sign up for a shift and go, but I can stay the whole day if you need me. And so by not asking too much, I'm actually getting more. So that's just a tactic that, the tool Google Form that has really worked well for me. And I'm going to stop there because, I could go on and on, but yeah, I just wanted to share some of those key kind of bigger picture things that aren't necessarily project-based, but also help sort of, flesh out the ranks of the Firewise leadership team.
Thank you. Um, One other person, Dario, do you want to share some things, or should we just go to have Jason have us with general dialogue? He's turning on his screen, so I think he's saying yes.
Yeah, yeah, Jason, that was really good. And a lot of that stuff is stuff we've kind of learned trial and error. Um, but one thing I found was, in case you touched on this, is when you're recruiting volunteers, make sure there's something for everyone to do because some people say, oh, I got a bad back or I can't run a chainsaw. But somebody can go get food and drinks the day before and bring them. Somebody could do traffic control. There's people that are really good at photography. I just have them just walk around and take photos and videos. So try to find something for everyone to do because the more people there, even if they're not all there doing grunt work, it's just a bigger group, a bigger crowd. And one of the things we promote in our Firewise community is that last word, community. That's the really important part of it. So it does build over time. In the beginning, you might not get that many volunteers, but if everyone's having a good time and you're getting some impactful projects done, you'll get more volunteers all the time. We usually get like 10 to 30 people showing up. And last year, we did an outreach through the mail to get a bunch of people involved in our Firewise community that weren't signed up, but they live inside the boundaries. And a bunch of those people showed up at our first event. So that was really rewarding to see these people just get out and then they get to meet all the people that live around them. So I I also like to limit it to 3 or 4 hours of work, but anybody can leave whenever they need to. But give people a chance to just stand around and socialize a bit. And I want people to get to know each other. That's part of it. It's not just getting the work done. I want people to have a good time. And one thing I learned on some of the bigger jobs, like we're doing roadside clearing, we're setting stuff up for chippers, we have winches, we're gonna pull stuff up the hill to the road. I should have been there or had some helpers with me like at least an hour early getting everything set up because people start showing up. You got to have everything in order, all your tools set up and everything ready to go. Um, Sometimes we'll do like a Scotch broom job and we'll show up right at the Scotch broom. And the first people that show up, they know what to do instead of waiting and going through the safety talk and introductions. They just jump in and start pulling broom. So I'm thinking next time when we do broom, I'm gonna have everyone meet just a little ways away from the broom, and then we'll all move over there and get started. And then sometimes some of these jobs, Jason, you mentioned some of these jobs are pretty big and like clearing a whole road, both sides of the road, that can be a big task, but I just think you do it, set out a chunk at a time, just do a little chunk at a time and be thorough instead of trying to spread out and do a half the job over a larger area. Because in the end, if you got something really good to look at that is impactful to the passersby, that's going to really help you get more projects done in the future. Um, and then the other thing is we do a lot of work in the winter because it's cooler. Um, you can get more done, you can burn safely, but you got a day plan and then you get weather and so you have to have sort of a backup. Like typically we'll have for a work day that's not like a prescribed burn, we'll just pick a day and an alternate day, like the weekend after that. Just so if it's storming, you can just push it back a week. And we did do a Scotch broom pull. We did 3 Scotch broom pulls, 2 in February, had beautiful weather. We did one in March and it snowed the night before, but 18 people showed up the next morning. We had a bonfire going and filled it full of Scotch broom. And so sometimes people will just work in inclement weather, but you can't expect that. So it's always good to have a second date close by that. And I announced that in the beginning when I sent out the request for volunteers, is this is the date, this is the time and the place, and then if that doesn't work, this is the alternate. So that's the main stuff that I would like to add. So anybody else?
I have one thing to add to that, Dario. First, you're Dario, for those of you who don't know, was the forester who did my UBET assessment when I first started, and I give both him and Joanne so many thanks. They were my mentors in learning about forestry and fire science, and yeah, so I really appreciate that. So that's the other piece is don't be afraid to rely on other people's expertise, you know, and I knew nothing about, I couldn't tell a pine tree from an oak tree and I still struggle, but whatever. But what I wanted to say about community engagement, though, is one thing that I haven't done it recently, that I have done in the past that was super successful is intercept. So what we did, because we have so many roads, but we have one main road, you bet. So all the side roads funnel into it. And so one of my gals, Anathea, who's like super social and, you know, she'll be there to support me and do whatever. We literally had balloons and windy flags and stuff. And every side road that was coming into UBET, we'd stop the cars and we introduce them and we tell them we have an event coming up. And we'd say, you know, we need help. And we're doing your Scotch broom and your road here. And we'd point at it. And they'd be like, where do I go? What do I do when I need? And, you know, having both of us, we call them our clown suits because we get it all dressed up in bright colors and go out there with balloons. And nobody was going to like get mad at us. And they couldn't escape us because it's the only way in and out. And it blew me away, like how many people the next day someone came back and said, yeah, you stopped us. This is who I am. And it was like, wow. So yeah, there's that. And it's incredibly effective. And then at the same time, are you in our Firewise list? And we show them a QR code and now they can sign up. And so we're capturing all this information as well. But it just, you know, you got to get out from behind the computer, which I'm guilty of, and get out into the field and meet people.
That's great. Anybody else want to chime in, or we'll send it back to Jason to kind of lead us through some questions, or raise your hand if you have questions, and I'm going to let him cover the kind of handle the rest of this.
I've got something to say.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, Jason, this is more kind of a question to you, and it's something we've also thought about or dealt with on Banner, is the communication aspect of this. And like many people are kind of familiar with email, it's been around for years, but it's the texting thing, like an app like Snapchat. Does BYLT, do they think about using something like that? Or what can you say about the pros and cons? Because between email and text, because you know most kids under 35 may not even know what an email account is. I don't know. You know, it's kind of a. So, anyways, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, at the Land Trust, it's mainly email and social media. I will say at the other nonprofit I worked at years ago, we had a much larger, the demographic was skewed much more towards younger adults who were volunteering. And so, yeah, we used to do, well, we kind of had an automated system. And so this is maybe not as relevant, but it does get to that point about using alternative communication methods where we were able to, I'm forgetting the program we used, but we had a list of our volunteers and their phone numbers. And we were able to send like a text that said, hey, don't forget, this is what's going on. Here's what you signed up for. Here's your volunteer leader contact information for the day of event. This is where you show up. And that was incredibly successful for younger folks. But that was, that was a much larger nonprofit that had a lot of money and was able to kind of use programs like that to keep folks engaged in many different ways. At the Land Trust, we've talked about our demographics skew towards more retirees, especially during our weekday events. On our weekend events, we found that flyering and posting on like social media to like family groups has been the most successful for recruiting new folks that we maybe we wouldn't have been able to reach in the past. So we'll post flyers up. I mean, it's not as relevant because it's, we're talking about the general county here. We're not reaching, outreach directly to our a Firewise community, but putting those flyers up has been really successful for us. We have one volunteer, like that's all he likes to do. He doesn't like to show up at events. He just give him a stack of flyers and he'll go all around town doing, putting up flyers everywhere.